It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Rob Farrett. Tens of thousands of people gathered in communities around Wisconsin on Saturday as part of the nationwide No Kings protest. Protesters pushed back on actions taken by the Trump administration that they view as authoritarian. Here's protester Rob Longwell Grice from Shorewood.
You feel so powerless sometimes sitting at home and seeing all the things that are going on. And personally, I think, well, what can I do? I'm just one person. But a rally like this makes you feel powerful again, that you're part of a movement, and there are others out there that are willing to stand up to what's going on.
The protests included dozens of communities in places like Rib Mountain, Eagle River, Waukesha, and others, as well as larger protests in the state's biggest cities. WPR reporters Sarah Lear and Nick Rommel covered the protests over the weekend. Sarah, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And Nick, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Nick, start us off in Milwaukee. Organizers of the protest there estimated nearly 10,000 people in the protest there. Can you set the scene for us?
Yeah, the protest started at Cathedral Square Park in downtown Milwaukee. That's in front of the historic St. John's Cathedral, and the park was overflowing with people. After that, they marched through downtown, which was quite a sight as their chants were echoing off the tall office buildings, and they wound all the way through downtown and back to the park. Took several hours in total.
Sarah, you covered the protest in Madison. How crowded was it? Set the stage.
Well, the Madison Police Department estimates there were about 15,000 people there. People marched about a mile from the UW-Madison campus to the state capitol. It was noisy, megaphones, boomboxes. The Forward Marching Band was there, which is an activist-themed brass band. A lot of American flags, a lot of red, white, and blue clothing. Also some LGBT pride flags, Ukrainian flags, Palestinian flags, and Mexican flags. There was a rally hosted by the Women's March earlier in the afternoon. They billed that as a, quote, kick out the clowns rally. So a lot of people in clown costumes as well.
Nick, what did you hear from protesters and speakers there? What were some of the common themes?
Well, the biggest common theme was criticizing Donald Trump's conduct as president, comparing him to a king or a dictator, and a lot of personal attacks against the president as well. But besides that, there are a lot of different ideas. People were protesting Israel's war in Gaza. People criticized deportations from a Christian angle. There are actually a lot of signs about, asking what Jesus would do in this situation. There were people protesting cuts to various federal services and programs. So definitely a lot of different ideas coming together in one protest.
And Sarah, the messages you saw and heard in Madison.
People had a range of reasons for being there. I would say there was a common theme about people worried about what they see as an eroding of checks and balances, and of a president trying to trample on the judicial branch or the legislative branch. I did talk to one Madison woman who said, ever since the first Trump administration, she's just been really angry about politics. And so she goes to whatever protests she can to channel her anger into action. And she said she felt really good Saturday to see the size of the crowd. And she said it was a reminder that she wasn't alone in her feelings.
Sarah, you talked with Anthony Guevara of Madison, whose mother came to the U.S. when she was 15. Here's some of what Guevara had to say.
So it's really scary that it could be anyone. It's not criminals. These are work hard people. Like my parents, they still work those 2 to 3 jobs. They contribute to society. I'm here for the people that look like me. I'm here for the people who can't make it today. I'm here to represent what it is to be Mexican and Guatemalan. I want them to know that I will make that sacrifice the way they made that sacrifice for me.
Sarah, did a lot of people bring up immigration as an issue that was motivating them?
Absolutely. And I mean, you can hear the chants in the back of Anthony Guevara speaking, chants of No Kings. Among the speakers Saturday was the immigrant rights group, Voces de la Frontera. A lot of people mentioned concerns about immigration raids breaking up families. They said they're concerned there's a lack of due process. Anthony, who you heard from, mentioned his experience as someone whose parents came to the U.S. from Mexico and Guatemala. He said his parents have their papers, but he knows a lot of people who don't. He doesn't like immigrants being demonized as criminals, and he's concerned about the Trump administration trying to share Internal Revenue Service records with immigration enforcement. A lot of people just felt that immigrants were being scapegoated, and they're concerned about that expanding to other groups.
We're talking to WPR reporters Sarah Lear and Nick Rommel about this weekend's protests around Wisconsin. Of course, the weekend had the tragic news, the assassination and attempted assassination of two lawmakers and our neighbors in Minnesota. That's something that came up. Here's one of the people, Nick, that you talked to reflecting on that.
First of all, condolences to the people who got killed. We've all gone too far, but we have to stand up for our rights or we will not have any.
Nick, was this a common theme you heard? Were people kind of watching that news as this protest was going on?
No, she was actually the only person who brought it up, and she quickly talked about, after mentioning standing up for her rights, she talked about being born in 1963 in Milwaukee to a Black father and a white mother, and the racism she encountered growing up. But then she pivoted to talk about how strong the community was in the Milwaukee housing project she grew up. And I actually met her while she was on the sidewalk doing call and response with a lot of the younger protesters walking by. And I asked her about that, and she talked about how the protest was bringing different generations together, and they're all bringing their own perspectives based on their experiences, like hers in the 60s and the younger people today.
And Sarah, you talked to Tanya Cam of Monona at the Madison protest. You mentioned that she mentioned the Minnesota assassination and said it's a sign that things aren't normal. Here's a listen.
This is the beginning of a monarchy when someone is talking about imprisoning people and not having a warrant and not basically defending any of his actions. And Republicans and Democrats need to stand together, or else we won't have a government that is a democracy or a constitutional republic, whatever you want to call it.
And Sarah, you've both actually mentioned some specific issues protesters talked about, immigration, war in the Middle East, things like that. How common, though, was that basic theme, that the idea, the concern that American Republican democracy is under threat?
That was a very strong concern that I heard from a lot of people, including Tanya Cam of Monona. She said that she identifies as a Democrat, but she said that Republicans need to come together and that this needs to be a nonpartisan issue. She talked about growing up in a military family with parents who weren't too political. She did say that she feels there's a need for more empathy in the country in general. She mentioned actions that she sees as showing a lack of empathy, such as ICE's approach to immigration enforcement and trans people being banned from active duty in the military.
And Nick, that fundamental issue, that concern, again, the theme of the protest is no kings. Did you hear that from many people, just that basic concern about what they see as a threat to representative government?
Yeah, for sure. And it was the most common theme across the signs people brought as well. Just generally bringing up what they saw as the kind of divergence between Trump's behavior as a person and the kind of behavior that makes for a Republican or really a Democratic Republican, whatever president. They saw that as a contradictory, and they made that clear.
I understand these protests had been planned for some time, but in the run-up, we saw protests in L.A., clashes between protesters and ICE, law enforcement officials, and then police, and then National Guard and military. I'm curious what you saw when it came to law enforcement's approaches in Madison and Milwaukee and interactions, if any, between crowd and law enforcement. Sarah, what did you see in the Madison protests?
So in Madison, it was peaceful. Police did release an incident report after the fact and said there was no violence. They did say that 3 people were taken into custody for vandalizing the Wisconsin Law Enforcement Memorial. According to the incident report, some organizers pointed out the vandalism to police. There was, I guess I will say, bringing up events in California was something that I heard from a lot of people in the crowd. They said they were concerned about Trump using the military in a really expansive way, whether it's displays of what they saw as force, as the military parade on Saturday, or the National Guard and Marines being called into California against the objections of the governor there.
And Nick, what did you see when it came to law enforcement and the protests in Milwaukee on Saturday?
I actually only saw 2 police officers during the entire event, so it was definitely a minimal presence. And as far as I could tell, before, after, during, it was entirely peaceful. And yeah, there was a drone flying over the protest at one point, and some people were worried that it was a police drone. But I saw a lot of journalists posting drone footage after the event, so I think it was one of theirs.
And Sarah, when you were listening to the speakers and talking to people, what kind of sense did you get from people about what would be next for them? Was there the idea that we're going to do this more often or take action in different ways, or a one-off, or what kind of things were people saying?
Well, one person who I spoke to actually said our existence is resistance. That's how he framed it. The idea that just by being out and protesting, he was showing, we don't agree with the Trump administration, despite the fact that a majority of Wisconsin went to Trump in the election. Definitely calls for participation in elections up and down the ballot, for more protests. And again, this protest was organized by people who see the president as being increasingly authoritarian. So to them, exercising their First Amendment rights was one of the most important things they felt they could do to stand up against that.
We'll leave it there. Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And Nick, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
That's Sarah Lear and Nick Rommel, WPR reporters who covered 2 of the big No Kings protests in Wisconsin over the weekend. We want to hear from you. You can email wisconsintoday@wpr.org. Were you part of these protests? Did you counter protest? Did you see them while you were out walking or driving? What are your thoughts on this weekend's protests in cities around the state? Let us know. Email wisconsintoday@wpr.org. Coming up, a deadline has come and gone for transgender military service members to resign under an executive order from the Trump administration. Meet 3 people at the center of the story from Wisconsin and Minnesota.
Transgender service members are in a very difficult spot where our lives have been disrupted, upended, and we have to start thinking about what's next.
That's next on Wisconsin Today. It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Rob Farrett. Transgender people have been allowed to serve openly in the U.S. military since 2016. Today, there are an estimated 4,200 trans service members. The Trump administration has given all of those service members an ultimatum: leave the armed services or be forced out. The deadline for that decision was earlier this month. Trump's orders are being challenged in the courts, but all trans service members now face an uncertain future. We turn now to 3 trans people who have served in the military to see how they're responding to the change. Sherry Swakowski is a retired Army colonel from Wisconsin with 35 years of service. U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Boston Hansen is a military police officer and trainer stationed at Fort McCoy near Tomah. And Bree Fram from Minnesota is a colonel in the U.S. Space Force who's held command at the squadron level, led Air Force security cooperation with Iraq, and led space acquisition programs. Colonel Fram, let's start with you. I understand you were placed on administrative leave just on June 6th. Can you talk about the situation you're in now that that deadline has come and gone?
Well, we are in a situation where we are simply awaiting our separation or retirement given our circumstances. So transgender service members are in a very difficult spot where our lives have been disrupted, upended, and we have to start thinking about what's next and how do we go on from here after years, if not decades, of serving a nation and giving it everything we have for it to now have turned its back on us.
And Sergeant Hansen, you've been serving the Army for 14 years. Again, this deadline has just come and gone. What is your situation? How are you responding to that deadline?
Well, currently, I'm still performing my duties. I'm not on administrative absence. I did express my intent to continue to do my job until I'm no longer authorized to do so. I am choosing the involuntary separation route, with also seeking a medical retirement because I do have some medical ailments going on that could make me eligible for that. So I guess it's one of those unfortunately but fortunate kind of situations.
And Colonel Swakowski, you were playing a role in convincing the Department of defense officials to make this decision that kicked in 2016, allowing trans members to serve openly. What have you seen between then and now? How do you see this having worked out in practice until we've hit this new decision?
I've seen our brave and patriotic trans service members who are fully qualified for their jobs and deployed worldwide being yanked around like a yo-yo, depending on who's in the administration. And when I was involved in 2016, it was at that time that the Department of Defense finally became an equal opportunity employer. And again, we're back to them not being an equal opportunity employer.
Colonel Fram, we heard Sergeant Hansen talk about that involuntary versus voluntary leave. Now, this is a decision that's been laid on trans service members now by the Department of Defense. Choosing that involuntary leave comes with a hefty financial penalty in effect. What was your thinking? What was your decision making on whether to get out before that deadline or stick it out?
Well, I want to make it very, very clear. There is nothing voluntary about either option. If there were truly a choice, we would all be continuing to serve. The only thing in front of us was either knowing and understanding most of the terms upon which we'd be discharged, or going into the unknown where the services had yet to publish any sort of guidance for what that involuntary phase looked like. Now, I have been a very public advocate for the transgender community, so there really wasn't an option for me. It's not as though I could have gone into the involuntary phase and just faded into the background. So this was a eyes wide open type of situation for me, where it was making the best decision for myself and my family to accept retirement at this point rather than face potential punitive action should I have taken the other route.
And let's stay with you, Colonel Fram. You're the past president of an advocacy group for trans service members. What kind of things are you hearing from your colleagues who are making that decision to retire, who made that decision for the deadline, to stay and risk being forced out, or maybe to fight this potentially in courts?
Well, we know the court cases are ongoing. The challenge is that by the time it returns to the Supreme Court for a ruling on the merits, we will all be gone, or at least the vast majority of us will, because that's going to take so long, and the deadline before the end of this year to have us all out will mean that we no longer have the opportunity to wait for the courts. So even if the Supreme Court finds in our favor and says trans people can serve, we will have had our lives disrupted. People will have moved on to something else. And that's a huge burden on individuals and on the institution that now has to fill holes where thousands of highly capable, highly qualified service members used to be. And so everyone going into this had to make an unconscionably difficult decision on how to proceed, given what they knew, what they didn't know, and what might be best for them and their families.
Sergeant Hansen, can you talk about what led you to the decision to stay, at least for now, past that deadline and keep that commitment to continue the service you've been doing?
For me, continuing to serve, even though this is being placed upon us, forcing us into these difficult decisions, it just proves that we are more than capable of continuing to remain in service, despite what some may think or say or feel about us. All we want to do is continue to do the job that we have signed up to do, serve this nation, and uphold the oath that we took.
Colonel Swikowski, on those lines, the arguments against having openly serving transgender military service members, arguments that it would interfere in some ways with unit cohesion, it would be disruptive, there would be potential medical costs that wouldn't be associated with other service members. What, back in 2016 and now in 2025, what are your responses to those concerns?
Believe me, it's just the same concerns that they had about women, that they had about blacks in 1948 when President Truman desegregated the military, against the gays later on, and Don't Ask, Don't Tell in the 90s. And all of those concerns were unfounded. And these concerns that they have now, as a researcher, I haven't found anything that's very valid. And, 5 of the judges and 3 of the courts has found nothing but animus. The Department of Defense has not been able to do much besides call us names, say that we are dishonest and untruthful and we lack humility and integrity. And that isn't any of the trans service members that I know, and I'm still in touch with quite a few of them. So these are honorable people. They have sworn to uphold the Constitution. They have done that under the most trying of circumstances, getting up each day and putting on their uniforms and lacing up their boots and going to work, even knowing that this organization that they've devoted so much of their lives to, and the person at the top of it doesn't support them. So these are some resilient folks and, highest levels of integrity.
To that point, I want to quote Colonel Fram from the executive order at the center of this, quote, adoption of a gender identity inconsistent with an individual's sex conflicts with a soldier's commitment to an honorable, truthful, and disciplined lifestyle, even in one's personal life. It's the executive order signed by President Trump, put into practice by Department of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. I note, Colonel Fram, one of your books is titled With Honor and Integrity. When you saw the wording of that executive order, in effect questioning your honor and integrity and that of other transgender service members, what was it like to read that, to hear that?
Well, the one thing I always go back to is, where's the evidence? Because we have thousands of transgender service members accomplishing the mission that they've been given here at home, deployed around the world, in every rank, every specialty, every service, and they have done so openly and with integrity for nearly a decade. We have transgender service members who are doing their wartime mission while deployed today being told, you are not deployable. And the only thing that changed was the perception of us by the people in charge. And so that's incredibly hard to hear because, as the courts have shown in the rulings that we have seen so far, there is no evidence whatsoever to back the government's claims. In fact, they point to our service records as Exhibit A for why there is no merit to those claims. So it hurts when your character is attacked with no evidence. It is a very challenging situation. But I think this speaks to what Sherry said earlier of the resilience of trans service members, that despite that being said, they have continued to lace up their boots and accomplish the mission until or unless ordered not to.
And Sergeant Hansen, for you, hearing that quote from the executive order, at a personal level, what do you think about that after your years of service?
I think it's an extremely invalid statement to say that we're not truthful, honest, can't hold standards of readiness is an absolute farce when we've been doing so, as Colonel Fram said, for the better part of a decade openly and in the shadows before we were allowed to openly serve.
We're talking with 3 trans service members about the Trump administration's attempts to remove them from the military. Bree Fram is a colonel in the U.S. Space Force. U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Boston Hansen is a military police officer and trainer stationed at Fort McCoy here in Wisconsin. Sherry Swakowski is a retired Army colonel from Wisconsin with 35 years of service. Colonel Swakowski, on a practical side of things, we face this if people have to leave involuntarily. If they didn't leave before that deadline, they face a financial hit. What do you worry about on a personal level for people who aren't just being taken out of a service they've committed to their life to, but potentially paying a financial penalty as well?
Well, I am heartbroken that we're back at this point from 2015 and 2014 when we worked to overturn the initial ban. This is folks' livelihood. They're good at their jobs. They have all kinds of commendations, but let's also remember that behind each trans service member, there's a family, and it's going to be extremely rough. Everybody has different circumstances, especially the junior service members. They don't have quite as much experience as some of the senior folks, and of course their pay is less. So it's going to be a pretty tough situation to be in going forward. But I will say that for those folks that are getting out, that the benefactor for this is going to be the private industry, because they're going to get some highly qualified senior leaders with lots of skills.
Colonel Fram, you wrote recently on social media about effectively your last duty before being put on administrative leave, issuing medals to some other service members. What was that moment like, knowing, at least for now, that was it?
It was hard to hold myself together, but I owed it to them. And if there was a fitting end to my service, to recognize those around me and how much they meant, how much their service and sacrifice matters to this nation, that was the perfect way to end it. Because throughout my entire career, it has been my honor to serve with, to lead, and to work for some of the most amazing individuals in this country. And to wrap up with that was both incredibly difficult and incredibly meaningful. And I am still grieving to this day the loss of the opportunity for more opportunities like that.
And Sergeant Hansen, I imagine you're maybe looking over your shoulder right now. How is it to carry on, do the mission, do the job while you're waiting for another shoe to drop?
It's filled with a lot of uncertainty on what my next steps are going to be. I mean, I got friends, family, they're constantly reaching out to me, asking what my plan is. They're worried about if I'll have to sell my home, if I'll be able to afford to pay my bills. And all while this is happening, I have to do my best to keep my composure and continue on with my mission. And it's incredibly difficult.
Colonel Swakowski, one possible outcome here is, and as a couple of you mentioned, the administration changes, the policy changes. If the administration changes in a different direction in a couple of years, it could change back. What does that potentially back and forth, a yo-yo, I think the word somebody mentioned, mean for that service member, that transgender service member, or somebody who's maybe thinking of joining the service?
Yeah, so it's going to be difficult for all of those folks, all of those categories. It's a personal decision. Experiences are all different. Some people have been fully supported by their commands, and they know this is not a justifiable discharge, if you will. And other folks have had tougher going where they haven't been as supported by their commands. So there's a real question there for everyone as to whether or not they would even consider coming back. And if from my veteran's perspective, if I kept bouncing around and it was dependent upon who's ever sitting in the White House, I'd have to really ask myself, is that something I want to go back to? What we need is a reverse don't ask, don't tell, whereby we codify in law the transgender folks' abilities and their capabilities and their willingness to serve, and we accept that and go forward under the law instead of just leaving it up to who's ever sitting at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue.
And Colonel Fram, talk now to maybe a transgender American who was thinking of going into military service. Presumably they can't now, I guess. What message would you have for them?
Well, I hope they'll consider other avenues of public service because it is incredibly valuable to serve and to operate in those environments. And I hope that we do get to something like Sherry mentioned, where in the future there is in law the opportunity for all qualified and capable Americans to serve. So I would encourage them to pursue their goals, get their education, build a network that is going to work for them. But don't let this dissuade them from anything in their future. The future belongs to them, and we need them to be their best selves and ready for it.
And we'll leave it there. Colonel Fram, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Colonel Sokowski, thanks for joining us again.
Appreciate the opportunity.
And Sergeant Hansen, thanks for taking the time.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you all for your service. Bree Fram is a colonel in the U.S. Space Force. U.S. Army Staff Sergeant Boston Hansen is a military police officer and trainer stationed at Fort McCoy in Wisconsin. Sherry Sokowski is a retired Army colonel from Wisconsin with 35 years of service. We've been talking about the deadline for trans service members to leave the military under an executive order from the Trump administration. Still ahead, two sisters from Brookfield are now best-selling authors of thriller novels.
I think Andy and I both are very focused on how to get readers to keep turning the pages. So all of our books have a lot of twists and turns in them, a lot of surprises.
Meet Andrea and Julia Bartz. That's next here on WPR News. It's Wisconsin Today. I'm Rob Farrett. Two Wisconsin sisters are taking the genre of thriller novels by storm. From Brookfield, Andrea Bartz and Julia Bartz started writing together when they were kids. Now living in Brooklyn, the Bartz sisters are New York Times bestsellers several times over. They both have new books out. Andrea's newest book is The Last Ferry Out. Julia's is called The Last Session. They're here with us today to tell us more about their new books and how they stay true to their Wisconsin roots, even in the Big Apple. Julia, welcome to Wisconsin Today.
Thanks for having us.
And Andrea, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Okay, I got to say, we see a Wisconsin author doing good, publishing. Great, let's talk to them. And then we find out, wait, there's two? They're sisters? Okay, let's talk to both of them. And I want to hear some origin story here. Andrea, both of you growing up in Brookfield ended up being authors. Can you talk about how you got started being into writing?
Absolutely. Well, we grew up in a home that was filled with books and reading was always encouraged. We took weekly trips to the library and came home with just big bags full of books. And we were both creative kids who were, co-writing stories when we were little. We had a typewriter we were, typing them up on, and we were making little picture books. So I think it was really natural when we were little kids that we were kind of telling little stories and trying to make our own books together. But that was just us being kids. So we sort of took different paths to becoming authors in adulthood.
Julia, what are some of your first memories of writing with your sister and on your own?
Sure. Yeah. Andy and I wrote various stories together. We wrote like a James Bond script that was probably about 10 pages long. We had a little series that we illustrated called The Ghost Gang. So yeah, we definitely like to write together. And then we also wrote separately too. And I remember writing stories in junior high and high school and just spending hours and hours working on these stories that were in my mind.
And Julia, let's stay with you. As Andrea mentioned, it's one thing to write as a kid and a great thing to write as a kid. It's another to say, hey, I'm going to try to write novels and I'm going to try to have the world read them. Julia, what was your path to that?
So my path was a little circuitous, I would say. I had always wanted to be an author. One of my majors in college was creative writing. I ended up writing two novels that were actually not published. By the time I got to the writing retreat, which was my first book, I was unsure if I wanted to move forward with the writing. And I was actually becoming a therapist at that time as well. But I decided to see if I could funnel all of my frustration, about my failed attempts into my first book, The Writing Retreat. And so that actually turned out pretty well.
And what was your road to publishing, Andrea?
Sure. So I knew that I loved writing, and in college I discovered magazine journalism. I was a journalism major, and I kind of threw the book stuff to the side and threw myself into, the magazine industry, which was a lot of fun and which I loved being an editor for years, but the magazine industry was kind of crumbling beneath my feet. At a certain point, I had been laid off again. I had worked at a magazine that folded, and I kind of thought, I love reading books. I used to love writing stories. What if I try to work on a project that's mine, that I can't come into work on a random Tuesday and find out that it's all been taken away the way that kept happening to me in magazines. So I started working on a manuscript, and that eventually became my debut novel, The Lost Night.
Now, you've both moved from Brookfield to Brooklyn, and that's the Brooklyn in New York, not the one we have here in Wisconsin. Andrea, can you talk about what led to that move? Was it because that's where the publishing is?
So for me, it was all about the magazines. I interviewed for a job at Condé Nast while I was doing finals in college, and got that offer right as I was finishing up college. And so Julia and I had always planned to live together once, I had graduated and to move to a new city. And she was in Philadelphia at the time. And I think I called her up and I was like, we're going to New York. Like we're making the move. And so we moved together way back in 2008 and lived together our first few years there.
And Julia, I've been a Midwestern guy visiting New York. I haven't lived there. What was the move like to, big East Coast city from the big eastern part of Wisconsin?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a lot of changes and differences. But I mean, I've been in New York probably about 16 years now, and there's just so much to do and so many artistic, creative things happening. So I really enjoy being here, but I also enjoy going back to Wisconsin. I mean, we go back at least once a year, hang out with family in the summertime. So I really enjoy going back too.
We're talking to Julia and Andrea Bartz. They're sisters. They are authors originally from Brookfield. They each published a new book earlier this year. All right, I want to get a taste of these books now. There's a thriller element, so I don't want you to spoil too much. Julia, let's start with you. Your newest book, The Last Session, came out just in April. Tell us a little bit about it.
So The Last Session is about a social worker named Thea who works at a psychiatric unit. And she is shocked when one day a new patient comes in who not only is her doppelganger, but also seems to have these kind of strange ties to her past. When the woman mysteriously disappears, Thea decides to try to track her down, and she ends up at this wellness center in the New Mexican desert. And the center is run by a couple who basically promises that anyone who comes to them for help will meet their soulmate pretty much immediately. So Thea signs up for one of the retreats and, starts going to the healing sessions and actually finds them pretty helpful, but then starts to realize that there's something much darker going on underneath the surface. And if she doesn't find out the truth, she might not make it out of her last session alive.
And Andrea, your newest is The Last Ferry Out. This isn't the Merrimack Ferry or the Madeline Island Ferry, but it still sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, this is a fictional ferry to a fictional island off of Mexico. And The Last Ferry Out is about a young woman from Madison, Wisconsin, who travels to the tiny remote tropical island where her fiance died in a tragic accident a few months earlier. And while she's there, she meets kind of this enchanting group of expats that her partner had befriended. And it feels like it's this really healing trip, and she's starting to move on until she wakes to a text from one of them that says, "You deserve to know the truth about your fiance. Meet me at the cafe 9 a.m. So she rushes to meet with this expat, and he doesn't show. And in fact, he seems to have disappeared from the island altogether. So the more she starts to examine the expats and their sort of pasts and what brought them there, she begins to suspect that her fiance's death was not an accident, and she just might be trapped on an island with a killer. It's twisty, it's immersive, and I hope it's a lot of fun to read.
I'm hooked on both of these so far. Andrea, you mentioned your main character is from Wisconsin. Does Wisconsin influence a lot of your work? Do you still feel some of that Wisconsin in your writing?
I think definitely being from the Midwest and being kind of a observer. I think people in the Midwest aren't always saying what they feel the way that maybe East Coasters are. Has influenced my writing in that it's made me such a sensitive observer, and I like to sort of think about where people are coming from and what they're saying. In terms of literally including Wisconsin in my stories, my third book, We Were Never Here, was set in Milwaukee. So that's got a lot of kind of Easter eggs for locals. And in this book, there's obviously the plot line that's on this Mexican island, but there's also a storyline, a sort of another timeline that is in Madison. And you get to see this couple together, and you see these two women, falling in love and arguing about having to drive from opposite ends of Madison. And there's hopefully some fun Wisconsin Easter eggs there as well.
And Julia, is Wisconsin showing up in your work?
Yeah, I think Wisconsin is always there in the background. I mean, all these books that I've written, including the two most recently published ones, were very personal books. And so in the last session, I actually go pretty far into my experiences when I was in junior high, and going to a school in Wauwatosa. And, it's a little bit different for the character, but there is a lot of crossover there for sure.
I'm interested in the thought about Midwestern psychology that Andrea mentioned. The stereotypical New Yorker is, "Hey, I'm walking here," and they express their feeling in the moment. And the stereotypical Midwestern is, "Oh, sorry, I got in the way of your car there." But on a more serious level, how does that influence your look at our psychology and what's going on behind the face we present to the world? Let's start with Julia this time.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Well, I think actually the last session really goes pretty deeply into that and questioning like what is beneath the surface. One of the main themes is cults, which are pretty prevalent today. And this idea of like, can we trust people? Can we trust what they're saying? What are people really feeling that they're not sharing? So I think that shows up in my books quite often.
And how about you, Andrea?
Yeah, I think I was raised to be kind of a nice Midwestern girl. And if I was experiencing what is a pretty normal human emotion, like anger or shame or impatience, it was sort of like, just don't show that. Don't have those emotions was kind of the message from my upbringing. And I think that's true of a lot of Midwesterners. And I think the through line of all five of my thrillers is that they really cast a light on elements of the female experience that we don't really like thinking about or talking about. They're not polite. They're not something that comes up at a Midwestern potluck or dinner party. And for me, that's exploring things like anger, fury, shame, embarrassment over not meeting certain societal expectations, all these things that aren't maybe polite to talk about, but I think are universal and really powerful to see portrayed in art in its different forms.
And your books both have been classified as thrillers. And I know publishers and booksellers want a genre, so they know where to put it and how to sell it. And Andrea, you just used the word thriller. Do you set out to say I'm writing a thriller, or do you set out like I'm writing a novel and it has some thriller elements to it? How do you see yourself in or out of the genre?
Yeah, I definitely am always setting out to write a psychological thriller. The psychology piece of it is fascinating to me. And of course, Julia is also a therapist. So I think we both are very intrigued by kind of human behavior. But I know that I want, an interesting social milieu. I like a close-knit, closed-door world, such as the expats in this case. And what I keep doing is taking a sort of social group like that and just throwing a dead body into the center and seeing what happens. So I always want dead bodies in my stories. So one way or another, I'm writing hopefully a thriller.
And Julia, how do you work within the thriller and maybe around it?
Yeah, I'm very similar to Andy in that I'm also just really interested in human psychology. And I also think that thrillers are some of the most fun to read oftentimes. I mean, depending on if that's, your genre or not. but I think Andy and I both are very focused on how to get readers to keep turning the pages. So all of our books have a lot of twists and turns in them, a lot of surprises. There's so many ways that people can spend their time and their attention these days that we want to make sure that people are having a good time.
Now, you grew up, as you mentioned, writing stories together. Julia, do you bounce each other's drafts across each other or go to each other to work out ideas still?
Absolutely. Yeah, Andy is one of my best editors, one of the harshest too, I would say, but I think that's fair as sisters. But we usually read each other's works. We bounce ideas off of each other, and it's really nice having someone that you can do that with and who really gets you and what you're trying to do.
And Andrea, has the idea of a collab ever come up, a co-authored novel?
It's past both of our minds. What's interesting and what makes Julia such a great beta reader for me is that our minds actually work really differently. So she'll look at, a plot problem that I'm having or, an idea that I'm trying to turn into something larger. And she'll just come up with a suggestion that's something that never would have crossed my mind. So I would imagine that some fun collabs are in the future, but right now we're both pretty focused on our next titles.
Well, and I wanted to ask, I know authors sometimes when they just had a book come out and they're doing publicity, the last question they want to hear is what's next, but you broached it, Andrea. What is that next novel? What's your next project?
I brought it up. It's on me. I have just started to work on my next book. It's going to be coming out in 2027, I believe, and it's a little bit more horror for me. So after I just told you I only write, psychological suspense, this one is going to be kind of straddling that line with a sort of modern twist on a haunted house story.
And Julia, how about you? What do you have lined up?
I have also started my next novel, and the working tagline is Succession meets Donnie Darko, and it's basically about a woman who gets caught up in a wealthy billionaire family and ends up on a yacht with them where very strange, disturbing things start to happen.
And I want to just ask, I know you focus on your own books, maybe one book recommendation from each of you. Julia, I'll throw that at you first.
Oh, there's so many.
And you can't pick your sister's book.
There's so many. I know. Obviously, Andy's. Our friend Somia Dave just came out with an incredible book called The Guilt Pill, and it's about a mother who starts taking pills that alleviate guilt and all of the kind of unexpected fallouts that happen from that.
And Andrea, how about you?
I am turning around and looking at my bookshelf right now. A recent one that came out that was a debut I really enjoyed is called Tell Them You Lied by Laura Loeffler. It's sort of suspense, not totally a thriller, but it's a really well-written and fascinating story in dual timelines about sort of the bad art friend dynamic of two very close friends in art school, and a story that eventually leads to one of their demise.
And we'll leave it there. Andrea, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having us. This was fun.
And Julia, thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much, Rob.
That was Julia Bartz and Andrea Bartz. They're sisters and best-selling authors from Brookfield. They each published a new thriller earlier this year. Andrea's is The Last Ferry Out, and Julia's is The Last Session. Hey, have you signed up for the Wisconsin Today daily newsletter yet? Each weekday newsletter editor Jenny Peak pulls together the day's top stories from around the state, great audio segments to check out, fantastic photos from WPR's photojournalist Angela Major, and there's behind-the-scenes content for a look at the people who work here and what we do. In one of the newsletters last week, I revealed the one time I was almost completely starstruck by a guest I was about to interview. It was legendary musician Herbie Hancock, by the way. There are also opportunities for you to provide feedback and weigh in on polls. You can sign up at wpr.org/newsletters. That's wpr.org/newsletters. Wisconsin Today producers include Colleen Leahy, Joe Tarr, and Avery Lee Rogers. Our technical directors are Sarah Hopeful and Tyler Ditter. Learn more about us at wpr.org/Wisconsin Today. I'm Rob Ferret. You're listening to WPR News.